My name is Margaret, and I am 65 years old. People see me today as an old black woman with gray curls and tired eyes, but behind this face lives a story that very few know. It is not just a story of wealth and beauty, but of betrayal, struggle, and finally, survival. I have carried it in my chest for years. And now, in this chapter of my life, I wish to tell it. When I was young, I lived a life that many dreamed of but few could imagine. I was blessed with wealth that came from my parents' hard work. My father was a successful businessman, and my mother, though soft-spoken, had the mind of a sharp investor. Together, they built an empire of property and trade. When they passed away, all of it came to me. I was only in my 20s, but I suddenly became the mistress of grand houses, shining cars, servants at my call, and a bank account that never seemed to run dry. I remember walking into ballrooms with silk dresses stitched in Paris, my jewelry glimmering under chandeliers, and people turning their heads to look at me. Men wanted my attention, women whispered about me, and society accepted me not just for my money but for my charm. I was bold, confident, and full of dreams. I felt as if the world itself bent in my favor. But even in that sea of abundance, there was an emptiness. The laughter of friends during parties often sounded hollow when I returned to my bedroom alone. I had money to buy the finest wines, but no one to share them with in the quiet of night. I had suitors, yes, but most of them loved the glow of my diamonds more than the beat of my heart. What I craved was real love, someone who could look at me and see not my riches, not my beauty, but my soul. At that time, I was dating a man. He was good in his own way, kind, respectful, but ordinary. He did not ignite in me the fire I longed for. Still, I stayed, perhaps out of comfort, perhaps out of fear of being alone. Little did I know, fate was preparing to twist my life in ways I could not imagine. One evening, at a charity dinner I hosted in the grandest hall of the city, I met a man who would change everything. He was different from the others, tall, pale, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. His accent was heavy with the tone of England, his manner polished, his smile charming in a way that felt both dangerous and inviting. When he spoke to me, he spoke not to my wealth but to me. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen. That night was the beginning of my greatest love story, and my deepest wound. Before that Englishman entered my life, I lived like a queen in my own world. My mornings began with sunlight pouring into my grand bedroom, curtains of velvet pulled aside by the housemaid. I would rise from a bed carved of mahogany, wrapped in linen imported from Italy, and step onto a floor so polished it reflected my face. There were servants to prepare my breakfast, drivers to ready my car, and assistants to arrange my appointments. I had everything a young woman could ask for, at least on the surface. I still remember the smell of fresh roses in the garden that stretched across my estate. Those gardens were my pride. I spent hours walking between the fountains, dressed in gowns that cost more than an ordinary man's yearly wage. Friends would visit, and we would sip tea beneath gazebos, laughing about fashions, politics, and sometimes about men. My wardrobe was filled with dresses from Paris, silks from India, and jewelry that sparkled even in the dimmest candlelight. When I entered a room, silence often followed me, and then whispers, some admiring, some envious. I traveled too. I had the freedom to board ships and cross oceans. I visited New York, Paris, and Rome. In every city, I stayed in the grandest hotels, attended operas, and shopped in places most only dreamed of. I was not just wealthy, I was admired. People often said I was ahead of my time, a black woman living with the freedom, wealth, and boldness usually reserved for men or for white women in those days. That reputation made me proud, but it also made me a target of gossip. Men courted me endlessly. Some brought flowers. Others sang praises of my beauty. But as I looked into their eyes, I could almost always see the hunger not for me but for my fortune. They wanted my estate, my jewelry, my status. Very few wanted the woman beneath the riches. And that realization often left me restless at night. What use is gold, I asked myself, if it cannot buy love that is true? Still, I tried to live fully. I danced at balls until my feet ached. I drove in open carriages through city streets, the wind catching my hair as crowds turned their heads. I gave to charities, not only for the poor but for schools and hospitals. People respected me for my generosity, but deep inside I was searching. For what? I did not yet know. At that time I had a boyfriend. He was kind and attentive, but he lacked the fire my heart craved. He never challenged me, never swept me off my feet. He was safe, yes, but safe felt dull to me. I wanted passion, excitement, the kind of love that would make my heart race and my world spin. I did not know then that my wish would be granted. And sometimes, wishes come with a price far greater than we ever imagine. The night I first met him is etched in my memory as if it were painted in gold. It was a charity dinner, a grand event I had sponsored in one of the finest halls of the city. The chandeliers sparkled like captured stars. The air carried the scent of roses and expensive perfumes, and the guests moved about in gowns and tuxedos, sipping champagne and exchanging rehearsed laughter. I stood at the center of it all, the hostess of the evening draped in emerald silk, with a diamond necklace resting against my skin. I knew eyes were on me, there always were, but his gaze was different. He was tall, with the kind of posture that spoke of confidence. His hair was golden brown, his skin pale, and his eyes a piercing blue that seemed to see more than the surface. He did not look at me like the others, not at my jewels or my status, but directly into my eyes, as though searching for the woman behind the wealth. When he walked toward me, I felt something stir inside me, something I hadn't felt before. "Margaret," he said, his English accent smooth as velvet. "I've heard much about you, but I must confess, words have failed to do you justice." His charm was effortless, his manners polished. We spoke that night for hours, about art, literature, travel, and the changing world. He was well-read, thoughtful, and unlike the men who usually surrounded me. Most courted me with flattery or shallow gifts, but he offered conversation, curiosity, and laughter that felt genuine. When he smiled, I felt warmth, and when he listened, I felt seen. From that night on, he began to appear in my life more often. He would send letters written in neat handwriting, filled with poems and reflections. Sometimes he sent small gifts, not jewels or luxuries, but books, flowers, and little trinkets that carried thought rather than price. He invited me to walks in the gardens, to dinners where the food was simple but the company was rich. We laughed together, debated ideas, and dreamed aloud of futures unbound by tradition. All the while, I still had a boyfriend. He was steady and safe, a man who gave me no reason to fear betrayal, yet also no reason to feel passion. With him, life felt like a routine, predictable, almost mechanical. But with this Englishman, life felt alive. My heart beat faster when I saw him. The air seemed lighter, the world brighter. He ignited in me a flame I thought I would never find. Slowly, I began to drift. I found excuses to spend less time with my boyfriend and more with the Englishman. Friends noticed the change in me. They saw the sparkle in my eyes, the eagerness in my steps. I denied it at first, told myself it was nothing more than friendship. But deep inside, I knew. I was falling. What I didn't know was that this fall would take me higher than I had ever flown, and then break me harder than I could ever imagine. The days following my meetings with the Englishman became a blur of emotions. Every letter from him was like a spark that lit up my evenings. Every glance across a crowded room felt like a secret we alone shared. My heart betrayed me long before my lips admitted it. I was in love, but love, as beautiful as it is, often demands sacrifice. I still had my boyfriend, the man who had been steady in my life for years. He was kind, he was loyal, but he was not the fire my soul craved. I remember sitting across from him one evening in a fine restaurant. The candlelight flickered on his face as he spoke about work, about ordinary things, about tomorrow being the same as today. My mind, however, was elsewhere, wandering through gardens with the Englishman, laughing at his clever words, feeling alive in his presence. The guilt pressed down on me. I told myself it wasn't fair. My boyfriend deserved truth, even if it would wound him. That night, I ended it. I told him that though I respected him deeply, I could no longer pretend. He stared at me in silence, his eyes reflecting disappointment but not surprise. He must have known, long before I spoke, that my heart had already drifted. He nodded, paid the bill, and walked away. I never saw him again. It was not an easy choice, but it was one I believed in with all my being. Soon after, the Englishman, whose name was Edward, confessed his love to me beneath the stars of my own garden. He spoke with passion, promising not just companionship, but adventure, excitement, and devotion. "Marry me, Margaret," he said, holding my hands as if they were the most precious things in the world. I did not hesitate. My heart shouted yes before my lips whispered it. Within months, we were wed in a ceremony that dazzled the city. The newspapers wrote of the union, between the wealthy black heiress and the dashing Englishman. Guests arrived in carriages, dressed in finery, and toasted to our future. I wore a gown of white silk that shimmered under the sun, and Edward looked at me as though I was the only person in the universe. For a moment, I believed in forever. The early years of our marriage were everything I had dreamed. We traveled across Europe, dined in castles, and spent nights wrapped in laughter and warmth. He adored me, or so it seemed. He held my hand in public, whispered promises in private, and painted pictures of a future we would build together. I felt alive, cherished, and for the first time, I believed I had found a man who loved me not for my wealth but for who I was. But love, as I would soon learn, can be both the sweetest dream and the cruelest illusion. At first, life with Edward felt like a fairy tale. He called me his queen, and for a while I believed him. We traveled together, celebrated together, and built memories in cities far from home. My laughter returned, brighter than ever, and I told myself that I had made the right choice, choosing love over safety, passion over comfort. But as time passed, the cracks began to show. They were small at first, almost invisible. A sigh when I spoke too long, a distant look when I asked about his day, a delay in his return home. I ignored them, convincing myself that marriage simply changes over time. But deep down, my heart knew something was shifting. Edward grew restless. The man who once wrote me letters, filled with poetry, now spent evenings locked in his study or away on business trips that seemed to multiply. He no longer brought me flowers, no longer asked me about my dreams. His smile became rare, his touch even rarer. I told myself he was tired, that perhaps the weight of responsibilities pressed too heavily on him. But truth often whispers before it shouts. I remember one evening vividly. I had prepared a grand dinner, roast duck, fine wine, and a cake I baked myself. I wanted to remind him of the warmth we once shared. But when he arrived hours late, he didn't even notice the effort. He sat at the table, barely ate, and spoke to me as though I were a stranger. When I asked if something was wrong, his reply was sharp, almost cruel. "Not everything is about you, Margaret," he said, his voice carrying a sting that lingered long after the words. That night, I cried quietly in my room, careful not to let him hear. For the first time since our marriage, I felt alone, more alone than I had ever been in my wealthy youth. At least then my solitude was mine. Now I was lonely in the presence of the man I had given my heart to. Rumors began to reach me, whispers from servants and friends. They spoke of Edward spending time with other women, of secret meetings, of laughter that did not belong to me. At first I denied it. I defended him even to myself. But denial cannot erase truth forever. His absences grew longer, his temper shorter, and the warmth of our marriage faded into cold silence. And then the unthinkable happened. One day, Edward returned home with a new light in his eyes. A light I remembered once being meant for me. But it wasn't me he looked at with that fire anymore. It was another woman, hidden in the shadows of his heart. Soon to step into the light of my home, the fairy tale was unraveling, and I could feel the ground beneath me begin to crack. The day I learned the full truth felt like a dagger twisting slowly into my heart. Edward had not just strayed. He had betrayed me in the most humiliating way. He had taken another wife in secret, as though our vows meant nothing. And worse, he dared to bring her into my home, into the house built with my parents' sweat and my inheritance, as though I were a ghost, a shadow meant to fade quietly into the corners. She was younger than me, with a face that carried freshness I could no longer claim. Her skin was pale, her laughter shrill, and her eyes cold whenever they met mine. She walked through my halls as if they belonged to her, touched my furniture, arranged flowers in my vases, and slept in a room that had once been my sanctuary. And Edward, my Edward, looked at her with the admiration he once reserved for me. The worst part was not her presence, but his cruelty. He began to throw words at me like stones, each sharper than the last. "You've grown old, Margaret," he sneered one evening, his arm wrapped around her waist. "You're boring now. Look at you, gray hair, tired eyes. She is everything you are not anymore." Those words burned into me. For all the wealth I had, for all the strength I once carried, in that moment I felt stripped bare. He called me black as though it were an insult, as though my skin, the very skin that once drew him in, had suddenly become a stain in his eyes. He mocked my age, my silence, my very existence. I tried to fight back with dignity. I reminded him that the house, the land, the fortune, none of it was his. It was mine, given to me by my parents, guarded by my years of care. But he laughed, a cruel laugh that echoed in the halls I once filled with music. "What good is a house," he said, "if the woman inside is unwanted?" There were nights I lay awake, listening to their laughter from down the hall. I could hear her voice, sweet and poisonous, and his deep chuckle following. The sound carved at me, each note a reminder of what I had lost. I wandered my own home like a stranger, unwelcome in the very place I had built my life. Friends turned away. Some pitied me, others whispered behind my back. The once proud Margaret, they said, now reduced to tears in her own mansion. I felt humiliated, broken, and above all, powerless. But as the days stretched into weeks, something inside me began to harden. Pain turned into anger, and anger into resolve. I realized that if I did not stand, I would be erased from my own story. Edward and his new wife believed they had conquered me, but they had forgotten one thing. This house was mine, my blood, my legacy, and I would not let it go without a fight. There are moments in life when a person feels stripped of everything, dignity, hope, even the will to live. That was where I found myself after Edward brought his second wife into my home. Each day felt like a cruel test. She paraded around the house in gowns bought with my money, sat at my dining table, and looked at me with a smirk that said, "You are nothing now." Edward only fueled the fire, mocking me openly, reminding me that I was old, that my beauty had faded, that my time was over. The humiliation was unbearable. I stopped hosting friends. I stopped going out. I avoided mirrors, unable to face the woman staring back, tired, broken, robbed of her pride. Nights were the hardest. Alone in my room, I would press my face into pillows to muffle the sound of my sobs. I felt like a ghost in my own home, a shadow that no one cared to see. For weeks, despair consumed me. I lost weight, I lost sleep, and I nearly lost myself. I questioned everything. Was I foolish to believe in love? Was I naive to think a man like Edward could truly see me, beyond my wealth? Every insult, every cruel word echoed in my mind. "You're old. You're boring. You're black." He threw those words at me as if they were knives, and I had begun to believe them. But deep inside, beneath the layers of grief, a small flame still burned. It was the same flame that carried me through my youth, that made me bold and unafraid. One night, as I sat in the dark, I remembered my parents. I remembered how hard they had worked to build the fortune they left me. I remembered my mother's voice telling me that strength was not in how many times you fall, but in how many times you rise. And suddenly I knew this was not the end of my story. I refused to let Edward erase me. I refused to let that woman steal my place. This was my home, my life, and I had every right to reclaim it. But I also knew that I could not do it alone. Pride had kept me silent for too long. But now, pride would kill me if I did not act. So I reached out to the one person I trusted above all, my brother. He had always been my protector, my confidant, the one who saw me not as a wealthy heiress but as his sister. When I told him everything, every insult, every betrayal, his eyes burned with anger. "You will not lose what is yours," he told me, his voice steady. "We will take it back, together." That night marked the turning point. I was no longer a victim. I was a woman with a plan, and though my heart still ached, it beat now with determination. The storm inside me had shifted, no longer a storm of sorrow, but of strength. Once I had decided to fight back, a strange calm settled over me. The tears that had soaked my pillows dried, replaced by a focus sharper than I'd ever known. Edward thought he had broken me, but he had only awakened a strength I had forgotten I possessed. My brother Samuel was the pillar I leaned on. He was older than me by a few years, a man of quiet wisdom and steady hands. When I confided in him, he listened with patience, his jaw tightening at every detail of Edward's cruelty. He did not waste words on pity. Instead, he spoke of solutions, of justice, of reclaiming what was rightfully mine. "We must be clever," Samuel said. "This is not just about your heart. It's about your inheritance, your name, and your dignity. If you fight with emotion alone, you will lose. But if we plan carefully, Edward and his woman will have no place to stand." And so we began to plan. We met in secret, sometimes in his study, sometimes in quiet corners of the garden where no ears could overhear. We gathered documents, property deeds, financial records, letters written by my parents long before Edward entered my life. Each paper was proof that the estate was mine, untouchable by anyone else. But paperwork alone would not be enough. Edward was cunning, and he had charmed more than a few officials into his pocket. We needed witnesses, allies, people who had seen the truth with their own eyes. My brother spoke to the servants, those who had watched, Edward bring his second wife into my home. Those who had heard the insults, those who knew the truth of my suffering. Slowly, the pieces began to fit together, like a puzzle forming the picture of justice. At night, I lay awake, not in despair now, but in anticipation. Fear still lingered, I will not deny it, but it no longer paralyzed me. Instead, it pushed me forward. I imagined Edward's face when he realized he had underestimated me, when the walls he thought were his fortress crumbled around him. That thought became my fuel. We also prepared for confrontation. Samuel reminded me that Edward would not leave willingly. He would fight, perhaps with words, perhaps with threats. But he also reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten. The house was mine. The law, if pushed correctly, would be on my side. One evening, as we reviewed the final plan, Samuel placed his hand on mine. "You are stronger than you think, Margaret," he said. "He stole your peace, but he cannot steal your spirit. Tomorrow we begin." For the first time in months, I slept peacefully. The nightmare was not over yet, but the end was near. The woman Edward thought was broken was about to rise. And when she did, she would not stop until every piece of her stolen life was returned. The morning of our reckoning was bright and clear, as if the heavens themselves had chosen to witness my return. I dressed not in silks or jewels, but in simple, strong attire. I wanted no distraction. No glitter, only the dignity of a woman reclaiming her own. Samuel stood beside me, his presence steady as a mountain. Together we walked into the grand hall where Edward and his second wife lounged as though they owned it. She was draped across the velvet sofa, sipping tea poured by a servant who once answered only to me. Edward leaned back in his chair, smugness painted on his face. When he saw me enter with Samuel, his smile twisted into a sneer. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "The ghost decides to walk among the living." His wife laughed, a shrill sound that cut through the room, but this time I did not flinch. I stood tall, my chin raised, my eyes fixed firmly on his. "Edward," I said calmly, "this charade ends today." He laughed. "And what will you do, Margaret? You're nothing but a bitter old woman. This house is mine now. She is mine now. You have no power left." Before he could continue, Samuel stepped forward and placed a thick folder on the table. Documents spilled across the polished wood, property deeds, legal letters, and signed testimonies from servants who had witnessed his betrayal. "This house," Samuel said firmly, "is not yours. It never was. Every brick, every acre, every coin belongs to my sister, and the law recognizes it." For the first time, I saw Edward's confidence falter. He picked up a paper, scanned it quickly, then tossed it aside. "These mean nothing," he spat, but his eyes betrayed the fear creeping into him. His wife's laughter died, replaced by unease. I stepped closer, my voice steady. "You mocked me, Edward. You tried to erase me. You called me old, boring, black, as though those words could strip me of my worth. But you forgot one thing. I am Margaret. This is my blood, my legacy, my home, and I will not be cast aside." Silence filled the hall. The servants stood at the edges, their faces tense, but I saw in their eyes the flicker of respect. They had seen me broken. Now they saw me rise. Samuel spoke again, his voice like thunder. "You have two choices. Leave quietly or be dragged out by the law. Either way, you are finished here." Edward's face turned red with fury. He shouted, cursed, pounded the table. His wife tried to soothe him, but her own hands trembled. Finally, realizing the walls were closing in, he stood, his voice low with venom. "You'll regret this, Margaret." "No," I replied, meeting his gaze without fear. "The only regret here is yours, for believing you could break me." And with that, Edward and his second wife gathered their things and left my house. My house. For the first time in years, I breathed freely. The day Edward and his second wife walked out of my home, the air seemed lighter, as though the very walls had exhaled relief. I stood at the doorway, watching them disappear down the path, and for the first time in many years I felt truly alive. Not young again, no. The years had etched themselves into my skin, my bones, my soul, but I felt strong, whole, and unshaken. When the gates closed behind them, I walked slowly back into the house. The servants looked at me with new eyes, not pity, not sorrow, but respect. Some even smiled faintly as if to say welcome home. I realized then that this victory was not mine alone. It belonged to everyone who had suffered silently, watching cruelty play out within these walls, unable to speak. My rise was a reminder to them that silence could end. The rooms felt different as I walked through them. No longer did the walls echo Edward's insults or his wife's laughter. They echoed only my footsteps, the footsteps of the rightful owner. Each picture, each piece of furniture, each corner whispered my story back to me, reminding me that this was my place, my heritage. I had allowed myself to forget it for too long, but now it was mine again. That night I sat by the fire with Samuel. He poured me a cup of tea, the kind our mother used to make. And for a long while we said nothing. Silence, but not the heavy silence of sorrow. This was the silence of peace. At last he spoke. "You did it, Margaret. You faced the storm and came out standing." I smiled, tears warming my eyes. "No, brother, we did it. Without you, I might still be caged in despair. You reminded me of who I am." He shook his head. "I only held the mirror. You were the one who found the courage to look." His words stayed with me. For years I had believed I was finished, discarded, unworthy. Edward had tried to convince me that my age, my skin, my very identity made me less. But now I knew better. My scars were not marks of weakness. They were medals of survival. My age was not a burden. It was proof that I had lived, endured, and overcome. I wanted my story to be more than my own. I wanted it to echo beyond these walls, to reach every woman who had ever been silenced, every elder who had been told they were useless, every soul who had been betrayed by the ones they loved. I wanted them to know, you are not finished. You are not powerless. You are not broken beyond repair. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, I whispered to myself, "Margaret, you are free." And with that, I finally closed the chapter of pain. The years ahead were uncertain, but they were mine to live, fully and without fear. I had reclaimed my house, my dignity, and above all, myself.